The letter came by certified mail on a cold Thursday morning. I almost left it in the truck with the feed receipts and fuel invoices. Then I saw the return address. The Homeowners Association from the subdivision east of my land was demanding $120,417.83 in unpaid dues, penalties, legal interest, and enforcement fees. They gave me 30 days to pay before they filed a lien against my property. According to them, I had owed them money for 14 years. The problem was simple. I had never joined their HOA. Months later, county records would prove they never had authority over my land at all. I inherited the property from my Uncle Raymond about 5 years earlier. It sat just outside town where the newer subdivision stopped and the older farmland began. The place was not fancy. It had an aging farmhouse with a tin roof, a detached workshop, 2 equipment sheds, and enough open ground to keep me busy every weekend. After years of commercial contracting work in the city, I wanted quiet more than anything else. My uncle had lived there alone for decades. He kept records for everything: old receipts, survey maps, tax statements tied with rubber bands. At the time, I thought it was just the habit of an older man who never threw anything away. The subdivision beside my property had grown slowly over the years. New entrances, decorative fencing, community signs, more rules every season. I never paid much attention to any of it because none of it applied to me. At least that was what I believed. Every now and then, HOA newsletters ended up in my mailbox by mistake. I usually tossed them into a pile near the workshop without reading them. They talked about pool maintenance, landscaping projects, and parking violations. None of it had anything to do with my land. At least that was how it started. 1 week after the certified letter arrived, a second envelope came by regular mail. This one contained a full breakdown of the charges: annual dues, special assessments, road maintenance fees, clubhouse renovations, late penalties stacked year after year. They even charged me for a private fishing lake I had never once used. At the bottom of the page, in bold print, was a warning that failure to cooperate could result in foreclosure proceedings. I sat at my kitchen table and read the packet 3 times. Something about it felt wrong immediately. Not emotional wrong, legal wrong. There was no membership agreement attached, no signed covenant, no document with my name anywhere on it, only invoices and threats. So I called the number listed on the letter. A woman answered after 2 rings. Calm voice, professional tone. She introduced herself as Gloria Vance, president of the Homeowners Association. I explained that they had made a mistake. She told me they had not. According to her, my parcel had always existed inside the original development boundary, and all property owners within that boundary were legally responsible for HOA dues, whether they actively participated or not. I asked her a simple question. Can you send me the signed agreement that says I joined? There was a pause on the line. Then she changed direction completely. She said the obligation was attached to the land itself, not the owner. I asked again for the signed paperwork. Another pause. Then her tone became colder. She told me ignoring the matter would only increase the balance further. I thanked her for the information and ended the call. Then I walked out to the workshop and unlocked one of my uncle's old filing cabinets. Something told me I was about to need every document he ever saved. The filing cabinet smelled like old paper and machine oil. My uncle had labelled everything with faded masking tape and black marker: property taxes, utility easements, insurance renewals, equipment manuals. There were even envelopes filled with handwritten notes about fence repairs from the late 1990s. I spent most of that afternoon sorting through folders at the workbench while rain tapped against the metal roof outside. At first, I expected to find something simple. Maybe an old notice my uncle ignored years ago. Maybe some forgotten agreement buried in the records. Instead, I found nothing connected to the HOA at all. No contracts, no payment receipts, no covenant forms, no subdivision membership papers. That absence mattered more than people realize. Land obligations leave trails. Counties record them. Banks require them. Insurance companies reference them. If a property belongs to an HOA, paperwork follows it everywhere. Yet my uncle's records were completely clean. The next morning, I drove to the subdivision office myself. The building sat beside the neighborhood pool near the main entrance. Fresh landscaping lined the sidewalks. Decorative stone signs stood near the road with the subdivision name carved into them. The place looked more like a private resort than a neighborhood association. Inside, the office smelled heavily of air freshener and new carpet. A receptionist asked my name, then disappeared into a back hallway after I mentioned the certified letter. A few minutes later, Gloria Vance walked into the lobby carrying a thin folder. She was confident from the moment she sat down. Not angry, certain. That stood out to me. People usually become defensive when they know their position is weak. Gloria acted like this conversation had already been decided months earlier. She opened the folder and slid several photocopied pages across the desk toward me. "This is the original community boundary map," she said. I studied it quietly. Something immediately looked off. The map paper itself was clean and modern. The text font looked recent too. Most of the parcel labels matched each other exactly, except for my uncle's property line. That section looked darker, almost like it had been added separately. I asked when the map had been recorded with the county. She avoided the question and instead pointed toward highlighted boundary lines. "All parcels inside this section are mandatory members," she said. I noticed another man sitting farther down the conference table. He had not introduced himself when I entered. Eventually he spoke. He said he represented the HOA legally. Not once did he mention his name either. He told me disputes like this became expensive very quickly and suggested it would be easier to negotiate a settlement before additional enforcement costs accumulated. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. They wanted payment before verification. I asked again for the recorded agreement attaching my land to the HOA. The attorney folded his hands together and said those documents could take time to retrieve because of the age of the developments. Then he suggested I begin partial payments immediately, in good faith. I told him calmly that I would not pay $1 until I saw legally recorded proof that my land belonged to their association. The room became very quiet after that. Gloria closed the folder sharply. The meeting ended less than 2 minutes later. 3 days after I left that office, another notice arrived in my mailbox. The balance had already increased. Now they were adding accelerated penalties and non-compliance enforcement fees. At the bottom of the page was a sentence that stayed in my head the rest of the night. "Failure to resolve this matter voluntarily may result in forced collection remedies against the property." That was the moment I stopped viewing it as a billing dispute. This had become a property fight, and I had the feeling they were counting on fear to win it. I did not sleep much that week. Not because I thought they would take the property overnight. Legally, things move slower than threats make people believe. What bothered me was the confidence behind their letters. They acted like nobody would challenge them, like the outcome had already been decided before I ever opened the envelope. The following Monday I found a bright orange notice attached to my gate. HOA violation. According to the paper, my perimeter fence exceeded approved height restrictions for the community. I stood there for a long time reading it. The fence had been standing since before that subdivision even existed. 2 days later, another notice appeared. This time they cited my equipment shed for non-compliant exterior appearance. After that came complaints about gravel parking areas near the workshop. Then a warning regarding visible agricultural equipment negatively affecting neighborhood standards. By the end of the second week, they had created an entire file against me. Every notice carried a fine amount. Every fine increased automatically if unpaid. None of it made legal sense. Still, the pressure worked exactly the way they intended. Some neighbors from the subdivision stopped waving when they drove past. A few avoided eye contact completely at the feed store in town. Rumors spread fast in places like that, especially once an HOA starts describing someone as a problem resident. One evening, a younger couple from the subdivision pulled over near my mailbox while I was repairing a section of fencing. The husband spoke carefully, like he did not want anyone hearing him. He said the HOA Facebook page had been discussing me constantly. According to several board members, I was refusing to contribute my fair share while still benefiting from community infrastructure. I almost laughed at that part. I had never used their clubhouse, never touched their pool, never entered their private lake area. Half the roads they claimed to maintain did not even connect to my land. But perception matters more than facts when organizations start protecting themselves. The real escalation came the next Friday morning. I woke to the sound of metal striking stone outside near the eastern property line. When I walked over, 2 contractors were unloading survey equipment from a truck parked partly on my grass. Bright orange marker flags already lined the edge of my pasture. I asked what they were doing. One of the men checked paperwork on a clipboard and told me the HOA had ordered updated boundary markers installed for future community improvement planning. That sentence immediately tightened something in my chest. Community improvement planning, not road maintenance. Not clarification. Planning. I asked to see the paperwork authorizing entry onto my land. The contractor handed me a photocopied site map with HOA letterhead across the top. My parcel had been shaded the same color as subdivision property. That was the first time I realized they were not merely collecting fees. They were trying to establish control. I told the workers calmly to remove their equipment and leave the property immediately. To their credit, they did not argue. Most contractors know when they are standing inside someone else's legal problem. After they left, I drove straight to the county clerk's office. The records department occupied a small brick building behind the courthouse. Most people only visited when buying land or handling estate paperwork. The clerk at the front desk looked confused the moment I explained why I was there. She searched my parcel number twice. Then she frowned at her computer screen. According to the county database, my property showed no active HOA covenant filings at all. No annexation records either. I asked her to print everything connected to the parcel history. She hesitated for a second before lowering her voice. Older filings don't always appear correctly in the digital system, she said. If there was a dispute years ago, you may need the archived paper records downstairs. That sentence changed everything. Because for the first time since the letters started arriving, someone inside government records sounded uncertain about the HOA's claim too. The archive room sat below the courthouse in an older concrete basement that smelled like dust and damp cardboard. Metal shelves stretched wall to wall. Most of the county's older property records had never been digitized properly, especially the subdivision filings from the 1980s and early 1990s. The clerk brought me 3 large storage boxes tied with faded inventory tags. "Anything before electronic indexing usually ends up in here," she said. Then she left me alone at a long wooden table beneath fluorescent lights that hummed constantly overhead. I spent nearly 6 hours opening folders and reading documents line by line. Subdivision plats, road easements, drainage approvals, utility maps, boundary amendments. Most people would have given up after the first hour. The paperwork was repetitive and technical. Legal descriptions ran for pages. Survey measurements referenced trees and fence posts that probably no longer existed. But eventually patterns started appearing. The subdivision had not been built all at once. It expanded in phases over several years. Each expansion required separate filings with the county, separate approvals, separate recorded covenants, and buried inside one of the oldest plat folders, I found the first important detail. My uncle's parcel had been excluded from the original development boundary entirely. The legal description was separate from every subdivision phase around it. I read the paragraph 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. The subdivision curved around my uncle's property instead of including it. That alone should have ended the HOA's claim. But I kept digging because something still bothered me. Gloria sounded too certain for this to be a simple mistake. Late that afternoon, I uncovered another folder containing proposed expansion documents from nearly 20 years earlier. Several nearby parcels had been added into the HOA through annexation agreements. Each annexation followed the same process. Signed owner consent, recorded covenant attachment, county approval stamp. Every file contained those 3 things, except mine. My uncle's parcel appeared briefly on one proposed expansion map, but a red handwritten notation crossed through the boundary line beside it. Not included. No explanation attached. Just those words. I copied everything. Every map. Every filing. Every page mentioning the parcel number. By the time I left the courthouse, I carried nearly 2 inches of photocopies inside a cardboard records box. That night I spread the documents across my kitchen table. The more I compared them to the HOA paperwork, the worse things looked for the association. The county maps and HOA maps did not match. Boundary lines differed. Parcel references changed between years. Even the acreage numbers shifted slightly from one HOA document to another. It looked less like official record-keeping and more like somebody gradually redrew lines over time until people stopped questioning them. The next morning, I returned to the courthouse and requested deed transfer history connected to my uncle's property. A different clerk helped me this time. Older man, reading glasses hanging low on his nose. After reviewing the records, he leaned back slowly in his chair. "You know what's missing here?" he asked. I already knew the answer. "No covenant attachment," I said. He nodded once. Then he explained something important. Under county procedure, HOA obligations could not simply appear because a subdivision expanded nearby. The property owner had to sign annexation documents willingly, and those documents had to be formally recorded against the deed itself. Without that process, enforcement authority did not legally exist. I asked him whether any annexation paperwork had ever been recorded for my parcel. He searched again carefully. Nothing. Not one filing. No signatures. No recorded acceptance. Nothing at all. For the first time since this started, I felt calm again, because now the situation was changing. Before, it had been my word against the HOAs. Now I had county records, and county records do not care who sits on an HOA board. Over the next several days, I turned the farmhouse kitchen into a full document workspace. Every surface held stacks of paper. I sorted records by year first, then by subdivision phase, then by anything connected to annexation filings. Once the documents were organized, the timeline became easier to follow. The subdivision developers had approached my uncle at least twice about joining the HOA permanently. The first attempt happened during the original construction phase decades earlier. The second came years later during an expansion project near the eastern boundary road. Both attempts failed. Neither annexation was completed. That explained why my parcel sat awkwardly between later development sections. The neighborhood had grown around the property instead of through it. But one question still remained. How did the HOA convince itself they had authority over my land now? I found part of the answer inside an old binder near the bottom of the final archive box. The cover read, "Community Correspondence." Most of the papers inside were routine letters between developers, surveyors, and county offices. Then I found a name repeated several times. Harold Bennett, licensed surveyor, retired. The address attached to his old business card was only 15 minutes from town. I drove there the next morning. The property sat behind a faded white fence surrounded by overgrown cedar trees. An older pickup truck rested beside a detached garage filled with rusting equipment. When Harold answered the door, he looked well into his 70s but still sharp-eyed. At first he seemed cautious when I explained why I came. Then I mentioned my Uncle Raymond. Everything changed immediately. "Raymond Mercer," he said. "I haven't heard that name in years." He invited me inside. For nearly 2 hours, Harold walked me through the history of the subdivision expansion fights. According to him, developers pushed aggressively to absorb nearby parcels because larger HOA boundaries increased long-term revenue. But my uncle refused every offer. Not emotionally. Legally. Harold remembered drafting survey corrections personally after Raymond objected to early maps that mistakenly shaded portions of his land inside the subdivision boundary. Then Harold said something that made the entire situation much darker. Some people on those later HOA boards stopped caring where the legal lines actually were, he told me. They cared what they could collect. He disappeared into another room and returned carrying an old accordion folder. Inside were photocopies of correspondence from years earlier, letters between attorneys, survey revisions, objection notices. One document carried my uncle's signature directly beneath a typed sentence stating he permanently declined annexation into the Homeowners Association. Another letter confirmed the county accepted the exclusion. I stared at the page for several seconds without speaking, because that document destroyed the HOA's entire position completely. Not only had my uncle never joined the HOA, he had formally rejected membership in writing. Harold allowed me to copy everything. Before I left, he gave one final warning. If they recorded lien paperwork without verifying this first, he said quietly, they may have crossed a serious line. That afternoon, I reviewed the newest HOA notice again. At the bottom, beneath the growing balance amount, appeared a statement I had overlooked earlier. Pre-line enforcement review completed, meaning they already claimed to verify the debt before threatening my property. Yet county records, survey corrections, and signed rejection documents all proved otherwise. At that point, I stopped believing this was confusion or sloppy administration. Someone inside that HOA knew exactly what they were doing, and they assumed nobody would ever challenge them hard enough to expose it. I organized every document into labeled binders before contacting the HOA again. One binder contained county plats and subdivision filings. Another held annexation procedures and deed history. The third contained copies of my uncle's signed rejection letters along with Harold Bennett's survey correspondence. I wanted the facts clean and simple. No emotion, no argument, just records. I emailed the HOA attorney first. Attached were scanned copies of the county exclusion filings and the signed annexation rejection from my uncle. I included the filing numbers directly from the courthouse archives so nothing could be dismissed as unofficial. Then I requested one thing only: immediate withdrawal of all collection actions against my property. The attorney responded less than 2 hours later. His tone had changed completely from our first meeting. Instead of threatening enforcement, he asked for additional time to review historical inconsistencies connected to subdivision boundaries. That phrase mattered. Historical inconsistencies, not unpaid dues, not delinquent membership. Inconsistencies. I agreed to meet them again at the subdivision office the following afternoon. This time, the atmosphere inside the building felt different the moment I walked in. The receptionist avoided eye contact. The attorney looked tired. Only Gloria Vance appeared unchanged. She entered the conference room carrying a thick stack of papers and sat across from me without greeting me at all. I placed my binders carefully on the table. The attorney started speaking first. He acknowledged there might be documentation gaps regarding earlier annexation procedures connected to my parcel. Before he finished the sentence, Gloria interrupted him. She said the community had treated my property as part of the subdivision for years, and that established precedent mattered as much as technical filings. I remember that phrase clearly because it revealed exactly how they viewed the situation. Technical filings. As if county records and deed attachments were minor details instead of the legal foundation for the entire HOA. I opened the first binder and slid several copies across the table toward them. Original county plats, recorded exclusions, signed annexation refusal, survey corrections. Every document carried official stamps or signatures. The attorney reviewed the papers quietly. Gloria barely looked at them. Instead, she repeated that my property benefited from neighborhood development and therefore carried shared obligations. I asked her calmly whether she could produce a single recorded covenant attaching my land to the HOA. Not a map, not a newsletter, not a board assumption. A recorded covenant. She did not answer directly. Instead, she accused my uncle of exploiting legal loopholes decades earlier to avoid paying into the community. That was the first emotional statement anyone had made during the entire dispute. And it told me something important. She did not actually have the paperwork. The attorney finally spoke again. This time he asked whether I would consider negotiating reduced dues in exchange for resolving the matter privately. I almost could not believe what I was hearing. Even after seeing the records, they still wanted money. I closed the binder slowly. Then I explained something very clearly. There would be no settlement discussion because there was no legal debt to settle. The room became silent after that. The attorney requested additional time for review once again, but Gloria looked furious now. Not loud. Controlled anger. The kind people carry when they realize authority is slipping away from them publicly. As I stood to leave, she made one final statement. "You may regret forcing this further." I stopped near the doorway and looked back at her. "The county records already forced it," I said. "I'm just reading them." 2 days later, the HOA officially filed intent to lien paperwork against my property anyway. That decision changed the entire case, because now they were no longer threatening improper enforcement. They had started it. The lien notice appeared in county records 3 business days later. Not a completed lien yet. An official notice of intent to secure one against the property unless the claimed balance was satisfied immediately. When I saw the filing stamp, I stopped handling the situation alone. Up until then, I believed the records themselves would force the HOA to back away. No reasonable organization keeps escalating after receiving proof that its authority does not exist, but this board did. So I contacted a property attorney in the next county named Daniel Cross. Several farmers and landowners around town had used him during easement disputes and zoning conflicts. Everyone described him the same way. Quiet, careful, expensive for a reason. I met him in his office the following Monday, carrying 2 storage boxes filled with records. He spent nearly an hour reviewing documents without speaking much at all. Occasionally he marked pages with colored tabs or wrote notes in the margins. By the time he finished, nearly every section of the HOA paperwork carried markings. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "They filed this after seeing your exclusion records?" he asked. "Yes." "And after receiving annexation rejection documents?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. Then he said the sentence Harold Bennett warned me about earlier. They may have just made this much worse for themselves. Daniel explained that HOA disputes normally revolve around interpretation, boundary confusion, covenant wording, assessment authority. But this situation looked different because the recorded filings appeared completely absent from the start. No annexation, no covenant attachment, no signed acceptance, nothing connecting my deed legally to HOA jurisdiction at all. Yet they still threatened foreclosure enforcement. According to Daniel, that created exposure far beyond a billing disagreement, especially after they continued collection efforts despite receiving contradictory evidence. He immediately requested certified copies of several county filings, including tax records connected to my parcel. That part became important very quickly. 2 days later, county tax records confirm my property had never once been assessed under HOA classification categories used elsewhere in the subdivision. Not once. For over 2 decades, Daniel pointed at the tax history sheet across his desk. "This is devastating for them," he said calmly. "If the county itself never recognized the parcel as HOA property, then the association's claim became even harder to defend. Tax assessments, covenant recordings, and annexation filings normally support each other. Here, all three contradicted the HOA position completely." Daniel drafted a formal demand letter that same afternoon. The letter required the association to withdraw the lien notice immediately, cease all collection actions, preserve internal board communication, and provide every document supporting their claimed authority over my parcel. The preservation demand mattered most. Once litigation becomes possible, organizations are expected to retain records connected to the dispute: emails, meeting minutes, internal votes, enforcement discussions. Daniel suspected those records might tell a different story than the public letters I received. The HOA responded 4 days later. They refused to withdraw the filing. Instead, their attorney claimed the board possessed historical operational authority over my property based on long-standing community treatment and maintenance expectations. Daniel read the response once and smiled slightly for the first time since I hired him. "That's not legal language," he said. "That's panic language." Then he started preparing for court, because at that point the dispute was no longer about whether I owed HOA dues. It was becoming a question of whether the HOA knowingly tried to enforce authority it never legally had. And courts tend to take that personally. Once Daniel became involved, the pace of everything changed. The HOA stopped sending casual warning letters and started communicating almost entirely through attorneys. Every message became formal, carefully worded, narrow. But despite the legal language, the board still refused to back down. Daniel advised me not to react emotionally to any of it. "Let them keep talking," he said. "People reveal themselves when they think pressure is working." So that became the strategy. Patience, documentation, silence when possible. I continued gathering records while Daniel prepared the legal filings. We requested certified archives from the county recorder, historical tax maps, annexation indexes, and every subdivision amendment connected to the development. At the same time, the HOA continued acting as though foreclosure was inevitable. Gloria especially seemed determined to make the conflict public. She posted updates inside the subdivision's online resident group describing an ongoing enforcement matter involving a non-compliant property owner. She never used my name directly, but everyone nearby understood who she meant. According to neighbors, she repeatedly claimed the board would set an example once the lien process finished. That confidence ended up helping us, because Daniel instructed me to save everything. Every notice, every public statement, every email, every invoice revision. I created digital copies of everything and stored backups on separate drives. Daniel even had me photograph envelopes showing postmark dates in case timing later became important. One evening, another certified letter arrived from the HOA attorney. This one demanded immediate payment again and warned that refusal could trigger accelerated enforcement proceedings against the property. The problem for them was simple. The letter repeated claims already contradicted by county records they had received weeks earlier. Daniel placed the letter into a separate folder labeled Knowledge and Continued Enforcement. I asked him why that mattered so much. "Because mistakes happen," he said. "Continuing after notice is different." That distinction stayed with me. The next major development came from an unexpected source. An older woman named Linda Harper contacted me quietly after hearing about the dispute from another neighbor. She lived along the western edge of the subdivision near several partially annexed parcels. According to Linda, the HOA had once attempted to collect maintenance fees from her late brother years earlier, even though his workshop property technically sat outside subdivision boundaries too. He eventually paid a reduced amount simply to avoid legal stress. Daniel asked whether she still had records. A week later, she brought over an old file box. Inside were payment letters, disputed invoices, and handwritten notes from meetings with prior HOA board members. None proved fraud directly, but they showed a pattern. The association had been pressuring uncertain property owners for years, especially elderly owners, especially people unlikely to challenge county filings. Daniel became far more interested after reviewing her documents. Then he found something even more important. Several HOA notices sent to me referenced mandatory obligations under recorded governing covenants. But by that point, they already knew no such recorded covenant existed for my parcel, meaning someone kept repeating legal claims after receiving contradictory evidence. That changed the tone of our preparation entirely. The case was no longer centered only on whether the HOA made an error. Now it involved whether the board knowingly continued false enforcement actions after learning the truth. And the more Gloria spoke publicly about certainty and authority, the more evidence she created against herself. About a month after Daniel sent the preservation notice, the HOA held its quarterly community meeting at the subdivision clubhouse. Daniel wanted me there, not to argue, not to defend myself, just to listen. He believed organizations under pressure often expose themselves publicly before they collapse privately. So I attended alone and sat quietly near the back wall while residents filled folding chairs across the room. The atmosphere felt tense immediately. People were whispering before the meeting even started. Some homeowners had already heard rumors about the county records dispute. Others only knew fragments about liens and unpaid dues. When Gloria Vance stepped to the podium, she carried herself the same way she always had. Confident, controlled, certain. At first the meeting covered ordinary business, landscaping contracts, pool repairs, budget adjustments. Then Gloria shifted toward legal enforcement matters involving community compliance. That was when several people turned toward me. Gloria never used my name directly, but she described the dispute as an attempt by a nearby landowner to escape long-standing obligations owed to the community. Then she made a mistake. She stated publicly that the HOA possessed authority through properly recorded development governance. Daniel had prepared me carefully for moments like this. Do not interrupt emotionally. Do not argue unnecessarily. Ask simple questions. So when Gloria paused for comments, I stood slowly and spoke calmly. Can the board provide the recorded annexation filing for my parcel tonight? The entire room became silent. Not dramatic silence. Confused silence. The kind that happens when people expect an easy answer and do not receive one. Gloria looked briefly toward the HOA attorney seated near the front row. He avoided speaking. Instead, Gloria responded by saying historical records were complex and under ongoing legal review. I asked another question. Then why has the board already threatened foreclosure enforcement if the annexation records are still unclear? Several homeowners shifted in their seats immediately after that. One older man near the center row asked whether other parcels might also have documentation issues. Another resident asked how much money the HOA spent on legal enforcement already. The meeting began slipping away from Gloria after that. She tried steering discussion back toward routine matters, but residents kept returning to the same concern. Proof. Not assumptions. Not tradition. Proof. Then something happened I did not expect. One of the board members spoke up quietly from the side table. I recognized him from previous HOA notices, but had never spoken to him directly before. He admitted the board relied heavily on historical boundary representations inherited from prior leadership. That sentence landed badly in the room, because homeowners suddenly realized something important. The board might not actually know which properties legally belonged inside the HOA at all. By the time the meeting ended, conversations had broken out across the clubhouse in small groups. Several residents approached me privately asking whether county records were really missing. I told them the same thing every time. Check your own deed filings. Nothing more. Nothing less. The next morning, Daniel called me before sunrise. Someone inside the HOA had apparently forwarded him internal meeting emails from board discussions after the gathering ended. Several board members were now questioning Gloria directly. One email asked whether the association had independent verification of annexation authority before collections began. Another warned that continuing enforcement without recorded proof could expose the HOA financially. Daniel printed every message carefully. Then he looked at me across his desk. They're starting to fracture internally, he said. And once organizations begin doubting themselves publicly, collapse usually follows faster than people expect. The dispute stopped being private after the clubhouse meeting. Within days, homeowners throughout the subdivision started requesting copies of their own deed records from the county clerk's office. Some wanted reassurance. Others wanted proof that their properties had actually been annexed correctly. The county staff suddenly found themselves answering the same question repeatedly. How do I verify my HOA filings? Rumors spread quickly after that. People started comparing documents. Some discovered minor recording inconsistencies. Others noticed amendments they never remembered signing personally. Most issues were probably harmless administrative problems, but the timing damaged the HOA badly. because confidence disappeared, and HOAs depend heavily on confidence. Residents pay dues partly because they believe the organization operates with legitimate authority. Once that belief weakens, every fee and enforcement notice becomes suspect. Daniel filed our formal lawsuit the following week. The complaint requested immediate removal of the lien action, declaratory judgment confirming my property was never part of the HOA, reimbursement for damages and legal costs, and preservation of all internal board records connected to enforcement decisions. Once the filing became public record, local attention increased fast. A small newspaper in town picked up the story first. The article focused mainly on the missing annexation filings and the dispute over property boundaries. They requested comments from both sides. Daniel answered carefully. The HOA did not. Instead, Gloria reportedly told the reporter the association remained fully confident in its legal authority. That quote appeared in print 2 days later. Unfortunately for the HOA, county records still said otherwise. After the article published, more residents began questioning prior enforcement actions publicly. Some attended the next HOA meeting carrying copies of their own deed filings. Others demanded explanations about how boundary verification worked. The board was no longer controlling the conversation. Now they were reacting to it. Then another problem surfaced. A former bookkeeping volunteer contacted Daniel anonymously. According to her, earlier HOA leadership occasionally discussed uncertain parcels during budget planning because some properties generated dues revenue despite incomplete documentation. Daniel arranged a formal interview immediately. While the volunteer could not confirm intentional fraud directly, she remembered repeated concerns about whether certain edge parcels were legally annexed at all. One statement from her interview became especially important later. She recalled Gloria once saying that most people pay when legal language scares them enough. Daniel wrote that sentence down carefully. Meanwhile, the HOA insurance carrier became involved after receiving notice of potential litigation exposure. That changed internal pressure dramatically. Insurance companies do not like uncertainty, especially when organizations continue enforcement actions after receiving contradictory records. Suddenly, several board members wanted outside legal reviews performed independently from the HOA attorney already handling the dispute. Emergency meetings followed. Residents demanded financial audits. Questions spread about how many other disputed collections might exist. And through all of it, Gloria kept speaking publicly with complete certainty. That became her biggest mistake, because every confident statement created another comparison point against the actual county filings. One evening, Daniel invited me to his office after receiving a new batch of preserved HOA emails through discovery requests. Several messages showed board members privately discussing missing documentation weeks before they escalated collection efforts against me. One email asked directly whether the association should pause enforcement until annexation verification is complete. The response came from Gloria herself. Backing down now weakens all future collections. Daniel placed the paper flat on his desk between us. Neither of us spoke for several seconds, because at that moment the case changed permanently. The argument was no longer whether they made a mistake. The records now suggested they understood the risk and kept going anyway. Court proceedings began about 3 months after the original certified letter arrived at my house. By then, the dispute had spread far beyond unpaid dues. The courtroom gallery contained residents from the subdivision, local reporters, and several nearby property owners curious about the outcome. Some came because they distrusted the HOA already. Others came because they still believed the board must have some hidden proof waiting to appear. I arrived early with Daniel Cross carrying 4 organised binders and several certified record packets from the county clerk's office. Across the room, Gloria Vance sat beside the HOA attorney reviewing papers rapidly. She looked more tired than before, though still determined. Once proceedings started, the judge moved directly to the core issue: authority. Not neighbourhood expectations. Not community benefit. Recorded authority. The HOA attorney opened first. He argued that long-standing treatment of my parcel as part of the subdivision established implied obligations tied to maintenance access, neighbourhood integration, and historical governance practices. The judge interrupted less than 10 minutes into the argument. "Show me the recorded annexation," he said. The attorney shifted immediately toward procedural explanations about missing historical records and inherited documentation problems from prior boards. The judge asked again, "Was the property legally annexed into the HOA?" The attorney did not answer directly. That moment changed the room, because everyone present understood the same thing at once. The court was not interested in assumptions. It wanted filings. Daniel stood next. His approach was simple. Calm voice, no dramatic language, just records in sequence. He walked the court through the original subdivision plats first. Then he introduced certified county maps, excluding my uncle's parcel from every recorded HOA phase. After that came deed histories, tax classifications, and annexation procedures required under county rules. Every document supported the same conclusion. My property had never legally entered the HOA. Then Daniel introduced the signed rejection letter from my uncle declining annexation permanently. The judge studied the document carefully for several seconds. "Was this ever challenged legally at the time?" he asked. "No, Your Honor," Daniel replied. The HOA attorney attempted to argue that later community conduct effectively replaced earlier exclusions. The judge shut that argument down immediately. "Community conduct does not rewrite county property records," he said. That sentence spread quietly through the courtroom gallery almost like a wave. For the first time since this entire situation began, I saw uncertainty appear clearly on Gloria's face. Daniel continued presenting evidence methodically after that. He introduced county tax records proving the parcel was never assessed as HOA property. Then he presented copies of HOA collection letters sent after the board received contradictory evidence from us directly. The judge reviewed several of those notices personally. One included threats of foreclosure proceedings despite the unresolved annexation issue already raised repeatedly. The judge looked toward the HOA attorney. "Why did enforcement continue after receiving these records?" he asked. The attorney requested time to explain internal confusion regarding historical documentation, but confusion was becoming harder to defend now because every certified filing pointed in the same direction. And every escalation by the HOA happened after those records became available to them. By the end of the first hearing day, the judge ordered all lien activity frozen immediately until final determination. Outside the courthouse, reporters tried speaking to both sides. Daniel declined comment. Gloria walked past cameras without saying a word. And for the first time since the certified letter arrived at my property, the pressure had fully shifted away from me. The second hearing focused less on paperwork and more on decision-making inside the HOA itself. That part turned out to be far more damaging for them. Daniel Cross called Harold Bennett first. Despite his age, he spoke clearly and carefully from the witness stand. He explained his role as a licensed surveyor during the original subdivision expansion phases and described the disputes involving my uncle decades earlier. The courtroom stayed quiet while Harold reviewed old survey corrections and annexation maps. Then Daniel handed him the signed rejection letter. Harold confirmed he witnessed the discussions surrounding that document personally. According to his testimony, my uncle rejected HOA annexation permanently because he wanted the property to remain independent agricultural land outside subdivision governance. The judge asked whether the exclusion was intentional. Harold answered immediately, "Yes, Your Honor, completely intentional." Then Daniel introduced the archived correspondence between surveyors, attorneys, and county officials confirming the exclusion remained recognized afterward. The HOA attorney tried weakening Harold's testimony by pointing out the age of the records, but the effort failed badly. Certified filings supported nearly every statement Harold made. Next came the internal HOA emails obtained during discovery. That portion changed the atmosphere inside the courtroom completely. Daniel displayed messages showing board discussions weeks before the lien filing occurred. Several members openly questioned whether annexation records actually existed. One email from a board member stated, "We should probably verify county filings before escalating collections further." Another warned that edge parcels might never have been formally annexed at all. Then Daniel presented Gloria's response. "Backing down now weakens all future collections." The judge read the message twice. No one spoke during those few seconds. The HOA attorney attempted to argue that the board acted in good faith reliance on inherited records from prior administrations. But the internal emails created a serious problem for that defense, because the board did not simply lack information. The records suggested they were warned repeatedly about missing authority before continuing enforcement anyway. Daniel focused on that distinction carefully. "Mistakes can happen," he told the court calmly. "Continuing collection actions after discovering evidence of non-membership is something else entirely." The judge nodded slightly while reviewing the exhibits again. Then Daniel introduced one final category of evidence. The collection notices sent after the HOA received our county records package directly. Each letter repeated claims about mandatory recorded obligations, despite the absence of any recorded covenant attached to my parcel. The judge asked the HOA attorney whether any verified annexation filing had been discovered at any point during litigation. After a long pause, the attorney answered quietly, "No, Your Honour." That answer settled most of the remaining uncertainty immediately, because without annexation, the HOA's authority collapsed completely. The final testimony came from the county records supervisor, who confirmed under oath that no covenant attachment annexation agreement or HOA acceptance filing had ever existed for my property in county archives. Not missing, not misplaced. Never recorded at all. I remember looking briefly toward Gloria after that testimony ended. For months, she carried herself like the outcome was guaranteed, like authority itself protected her automatically. Now she stared down at the table without speaking. The court recessed briefly before final arguments, and by then, almost everyone in the room already understood how the decision was going to end. The final hearing lasted less than 2 hours. Compared to everything leading up to it, the courtroom felt strangely quiet that morning. Most of the uncertainty had already disappeared during earlier testimony. What remained now was the judge's decision and how strongly the court intended to address the HOA's conduct. Daniel Cross kept his closing argument simple. He reminded the court that property authority in this county depended on recorded filings, not assumptions or neighborhood expectations. He walked through the same core facts one final time. No annexation agreement, no covenant attachment, no signed acceptance, no tax classification recognizing HOA membership. Then he focused on the escalation itself. The board received contradictory records. The board questioned authority internally. The board continued collection efforts anyway. Finally, Daniel addressed the lien threat directly. Property owners should not fear foreclosure from organizations lacking legal jurisdiction over their land, he said calmly. The HOA attorney argued briefly after that. He emphasized administrative confusion inherited from earlier boards and claimed the association acted based on long-standing operational understanding rather than malicious intent. But by then, even he sounded resigned, because the evidence problem never changed. Nothing legally connected my parcel to the HOA. After both sides finished, the judge reviewed notes silently for several minutes before speaking. His ruling was direct from the beginning. The court found that my property had never been lawfully annexed into the homeowners association at any point. Therefore, the HOA possessed no authority to assess dues, impose penalties, threaten foreclosure, or initiate lien enforcement actions against the parcel. Every collection demand was declared invalid. Every enforcement notice connected to the property became unenforceable immediately. Then the judge addressed the board's conduct separately. He stated that continuing enforcement after receiving substantial contradictory evidence reflected serious disregard for proper verification obligations. The courtroom stayed completely silent during that part. The judge ordered immediate removal of all lien filings and directed the HOA to reimburse my legal costs connected to the dispute. But he did not stop there. He also left open the possibility for additional civil claims by other affected property owners if future evidence revealed broader improper collection practices. That statement visibly shook several HOA board members sitting behind Gloria, because everyone understood what it meant. This case was no longer isolated. The ruling could trigger other challenges too. Then came the final moment I remember most clearly. The judge looked directly toward the HOA representatives and said, "Authority over private property must be earned through lawful process. It cannot be assumed through repetition." No one moved for several seconds afterward. Then the hearing ended. Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered immediately near the courthouse steps. Cameras pointed toward both legal teams, while residents from the subdivision stood nearby, talking quietly among themselves. Daniel answered only one question publicly. He confirmed the ruling established that my property never legally belonged to the HOA. Nothing more. No celebration. No speeches. Gloria exited through a side hallway without speaking to anyone. Several board members followed behind her separately rather than together. That detail stayed with me too. Because during the early months of the dispute, they always moved as one group. Now they looked like strangers leaving the same building by coincidence. Later that afternoon, Daniel called me after reviewing final filing instructions from the court clerk. "It's over," he said simply. I walked out onto the back porch afterward and looked across the pasture toward the eastern property line where those survey flags once stood. The land looked exactly the same as it had before all of this started. Quiet. Still, unimpressed by paperwork and arguments alike, the fallout inside the subdivision started almost immediately after the ruling became public. Within a week, 2 HOA board members resigned. Neither gave detailed explanations. One cited personal reasons. The other mentioned stress connected to ongoing litigation concerns. But residents already understood the real issue. Trust had collapsed. Emergency HOA meetings followed throughout the next month. Homeowners demanded financial transparency, legal explanations, and independent reviews of prior enforcement practices. Attendance at those meetings reportedly doubled compared to normal turnout. People wanted answers now, especially older residents. Several property owners contacted Daniel privately after hearing about the court ruling. Some believed they had paid questionable fees years earlier simply because they feared liens or legal costs. Others wanted help reviewing older annexation paperwork tied to edge parcels around the subdivision. Daniel told me he expected additional lawsuits eventually, not necessarily because every collection had been unlawful, but because once people lose confidence in an organization's authority, they begin re-examining everything that authority ever demanded from them. The HOA insurance carrier also became more aggressive afterward. Independent auditors requested records connected to enforcement actions, internal board discussions, and legal approvals preceding the lien attempt against my property. That pressure mattered financially. Insurance companies calculate risk carefully. A board that ignores contradictory records while threatening foreclosure creates expensive exposure. About 6 weeks after the ruling, Gloria Vance resigned officially as HOA president. The announcement appeared in a short community email with almost no detail attached. No public apology. No explanation regarding the lawsuit. Just notice of leadership transition and temporary interim management procedures. By then, most residents cared less about Gloria personally than the larger question surrounding the association itself. Could the board still be trusted? Meanwhile, life around my property slowly returned to normal. The county removed every lien notice connected to my parcel from public records completely. Daniel made sure certified confirmations were filed properly, so no future title confusion could appear later during sales or transfers. I replaced the temporary survey markers near the eastern boundary with permanent steel posts set deep into the ground. Not because I expected another immediate fight, but because clear boundaries matter once people start testing them. Some neighbors from the subdivision began speaking to me again gradually. A few apologized quietly for believing the rumors early on. Others admitted they assumed the HOA must have verified everything before threatening foreclosure. That assumption was the entire problem. Most people trust official-looking paperwork automatically, especially when legal language appears on expensive letterhead. One evening near sunset, the younger couple who warned me earlier about the HOA Facebook discussions stopped by my gate again. This time the conversation felt completely different. No caution. No whispering. The husband shook his head slowly while looking toward the subdivision entrance in the distance. All those years, he said, nobody checked. I understood exactly what he meant. People assumed authority existed because authority sounded confident. But confidence and legality are not the same thing. After they left, I walked back toward the barn while the sun dropped behind the pasture fencing. For the first time in months, the property felt quiet again. Not victorious, just peaceful. And after everything that happened, that felt more valuable than winning ever could. A few months later, most visible signs of the dispute had faded from daily life. The subdivision replaced several board members through special elections. New leadership promised transparency reviews and stricter verification procedures before future enforcement actions. Whether those promises lasted long-term, I could not say. I stayed out of it completely. That was never my community to manage. I returned to the routines I trusted before any of this started. Fence repairs, equipment maintenance, early mornings with coffee on the porch before the heat settled across the fields. Quiet work has a way of resetting the mind. Sometimes people in town still asked about the lawsuit, usually at the hardware store or feed supply counter. Most wanted details about the courtroom ruling or Gloria's resignation. Others mainly wanted reassurance that property records still mattered more than HOA pressure. I always gave roughly the same answer. Read your own filings carefully. Nothing dramatic, just practical advice. Because the truth was simpler than people expected. This entire situation survived as long as it did because almost nobody checked the underlying paperwork. The HOA relied heavily on appearance, confidence, and legal language that sounded official enough to discourage resistance. And honestly, that strategy probably worked many times before. Most people do not have the time, money, or patience to challenge organizations threatening liens against their homes. They panic. They settle. They assume the board already verified everything properly. That assumption nearly cost me my property too. One afternoon, I reopened the old filing cabinet in my workshop while searching for tractor receipts. The same cabinet I unlocked the night this entire mess truly began. I stopped for a moment looking at the rows of folders my uncle spent decades organizing. Back then, I used to think his habit of saving every paper bordered on obsession. Now I understood differently. Records preserve memory, and memory matters when powerful people start rewriting history to suit themselves. Without those documents, the HOA probably would have succeeded eventually. Maybe not immediately, but pressure wears people down over time. Legal fees grow. Threats escalate. Fear does the rest. Paperwork interrupted that process. Not anger, not shouting, not revenge, just records. Later that evening, I walked the eastern property line again while checking the permanent survey posts we installed after the ruling. Beyond them, subdivision lights glowed faintly near the entrance road. The boundary looked ordinary. A few feet of grass, fence wire, steel markers. Yet that narrow strip represented months of legal fighting and years of assumed authority that never legally existed in the first place. I stood there until sunset disappeared fully behind the tree line. Then I headed back toward the farmhouse. The same farmhouse my uncle protected decades earlier by refusing to sign papers he did not trust. Turns out he understood something important long before I did. Authority means nothing unless the law actually supports it. And eventually, if someone digs deep enough, the records always tell the truth. Looking back now, the strangest part of the entire experience was how ordinary everything appeared in the beginning. A certified letter, a few official stamps, legal wording printed in bold. That was enough to make the situation feel real immediately, even before I verified whether any authority actually existed behind it. I understand now why so many people comply automatically when organizations threaten property action. Most of us are trained to believe that if paperwork looks formal enough, someone already checked the facts carefully beforehand. But systems fail when nobody questions them. And sometimes people inside those systems learn they can operate on confidence alone for years without challenge. That seemed to be exactly what happened here. The HOA kept expanding its practical authority beyond its legal authority because nobody stopped it early enough. New board members inherited assumptions from older boards. Those assumptions hardened into policy. Policy eventually became enforcement. Then enforcement started generating money. By the time anyone seriously questioned the boundaries, the organization treated doubt itself like rebellion. I thought about that often after the case ended, especially during quiet mornings outside the workshop while sorting tools or repairing equipment. The land never changed during any of this. The fences stayed where they always were. The farmhouse remained in the same place. County records remained stored in the same courthouse basement they occupied for decades. Only the story surrounding the property changed. The HOA told one version loudly and repeatedly until people accepted it without verification. The records told another version quietly the entire time. That difference matters more than most people realize. Because in property disputes, repetition can sound a lot like truth after enough years pass. One Saturday afternoon, I received a handwritten letter from an older man living 2 counties away. He said he read about the lawsuit in a regional paper and later discovered questionable covenant filings attached to land inherited from his parents. He thanked me for fighting publicly instead of settling privately. That letter stayed with me. Not because of pride, because it reminded me how many people probably surrender to pressure simply because they assume resistance is impossible. Legal systems move slowly. Research takes time. Records are frustrating to sort through. Most organizations know that. They count on exhaustion. What they do not expect is patience. Patience changes leverage completely. That was the real lesson my uncle understood years earlier when he rejected annexation permanently instead of verbally arguing with developers. He documented everything. Then he waited. In the end, that quiet preparation protected the property decades later, long after he was gone. Every now and then, I still pass the subdivision entrance while driving into town for supplies. The decorative signs remain there. The landscaping changes seasonally. Different board members rotate through leadership now, but nobody sends notices to my mailbox anymore. Nobody places violation papers on my gate. Nobody talks about foreclosure. The boundary finally returned to what it always should have been, a legal line instead of a financial opportunity. And every time I unlock that old filing cabinet in the workshop, I remember the same thing. Paperwork tells the truth eventually, You just have to keep digging long enough to find it.